My name is Martin Ouředníček, and together with my colleagues Adam Klsák and Adela Petrovic, we are the organizers of the seminar. And together with us, we will have three other speakers, two from Canada, which is Roger Kyle and Steven Logan, and one from Russia, Siberia, Konstantin Grigorichev. The motivation for the realization of this seminar was 2 years ago, our invitation to Siberia, to Irkutsk by Konstantin, and we enjoy quite a lot together with Adam and Irina Meshkal, our trip. And one of the main surprising things were the form and extension and also legal status of Siberian suburbs, and my colleagues then continued to yurta suburbs around Ulaanbaatar. So we decided to compare at least these two cases from, let's say, post-socialist Europe, but maybe from Eastern and from Central part of the world, to something what is more understandable to Western world, and we ask and we try to write an email to global suburban guru, I would say, Roger Kyle, and then we also contacted Steven Logan with nice history of research from Canada, but also from Prague housing estates. So it was quite nice surprise that they all agree, and now we are here to present three presentation under the common headline 1001 forms of suburbanization, comparative research, terminology, and methods. And let me briefly introduce all three participants, and I would share now the screen with you with the introductory presentation. So the host institution is Charles University and the Department of Social Geography and Regional Development, and our team with name Urban and Regional Laboratory. And as a first presenter, Roger Kyle will be, who is a professor at the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change, York University in Toronto. And what is promising that there is forthcoming a new book with the title After Suburbia, so everything is looking forward for this. And Roger Kyle research areas are, let's say, global suburbanization, but today more focused on actual topic on infectious disease of COVID-19 together with colleagues from Europe. Then Steven is focused on history of suburbs. He's now at the University of Toronto, and again we already bought the new book where Prague is very important, and Etarea project and Prague Southtown housing estate is very important, and it was very nice reading. And it explores parallel between Toronto and Prague, even not directly to this suburban family houses, but more housing estates inside Prague. Then Konstantin is a professor and also vice rector at Irkutsk State University, and he is a sociologist, and the specific focus on suburbanism and lifestyle around Siberian cities, and generally transformation of urban space, and also legal status status of urban spaces within especially Siberian cities. And then let me introduce myself. I am associate professor at Charles University. I'm geographer, and thematic cartography and social geography, urban and community studies are my space of interest. Let me briefly introduce also you all, and Adam produced this simple maps based on your admission or the questionnaire with what you filled it in the form, and you can see that except Australia and Africa, we have very nice auditorium, and we are looking forward for your discussion from different parts of the world, from Brazil to Siberia and to US and Canada and India. This is briefly the structure and organization of the webinar. Maybe the most important is that we plan discussion at least 30 minutes after our presentation, and that from the, let's say, this organizational point of view, we will be happy for your questions and comment using chat in Zoom. But of course, you can even participate after our presentation and raise the hand in the application and participate directly within the discussion section. So this is all. We would like to thank our donor, which is Czech Science Foundation and the project on Czech suburbs. So this is briefly the intro, and now I will stop my share and would like to ask kindly Roger and Steven for the first presentation.
Okay. Thanks, Martin Ouředníček, for the introduction and for inviting us. Roger and I have titled our talk Out of the Suburb, Toronto and Global Suburbanization. Martin mentioned where we come from. Both of us, interestingly enough, teach at two very suburban universities in Toronto. I'm at the University of Toronto in Mississauga, and Roger is at York University in North York. And interestingly enough, both of these suburban places will figure into both of our talks. I will give the first part of the talk, which will be more historical. And then Roger will continue in a more expanding it out and also going more globally. So I want to begin my part of the presentation today in 1960s era Toronto, in the burgeoning suburb of North York. The plan on the left that you see there was released to much press in 1968, and it would reshape the center of North York into a very modern suburban downtown in anticipation of the arrival of the metro. Reminiscent of some of Le Corbusier's fantastical drawings from the 19th, was devised by one of Canada's most architectural firms. And the lead architect, John Parkin, had this to say on the transformation of the suburb. He said that both the city and the suburb are terms that have become obsolete because of new forms of transportation and communication: the automobile, the metro, the elevator, and telecommunication. He believed there was no agreed upon definition or term to describe the urban transformations that were happening in the 1960s and which they were trying to plan out. In 1961, in his book, The City in History, Lewis Mumford provocatively claimed that with this urban explosion, parts of the city and suburbs scattered across the urban region, he argued that the suburb as such had become a thing of the past. A year earlier, in 1967, architects and planners from around the world gathered at Toronto's newest university, the aforementioned York University, which you see there on the right. This picture was taken a little bit later than the 60s. I think it's from the early 70s, but you get an idea of what it looks like, which is also situated in North York, to discuss the problems of big cities. Among the many countries from around the world, there was a strong contingent from Central and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. So there were representatives from Prague, Moscow, Leningrad, Budapest, and Warsaw. There was a 5-person Czech delegation that included the urban planner Jiří Hruza. His work, especially including his 1962 book, Města budoucnost, The City of the Future, sought also to rethink how the socialist city and its satellite suburbs might look in light of Western developments in urban planning. So I mentioned a little bit of this. This is how, in the opening to my book, In the Suburbs of History, I use this meeting as a jumping off point to compare Czech and Canadian utopian responses to the urban problems of the 1960s. The edges of cities is where a lot of this utopia was being implemented on the ground. So what I want to talk about in the time I have is I'll talk a little bit about some of the research from that book, but obviously I'm not going to talk to you about Czech socialist cities, because that's, you know all about that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about North York. So just we're among geographers, so I thought I would include a map of Toronto with its surrounding suburbs and municipalities. So here we see the downtown core of Toronto, the subway line moving up to where it ends in North York, the area where I'm going to talk about today, which expands sort of this northern part of Toronto to a global the mappable suburbs. But Roger and I are taking you to this part of North America in the spirit of the title of the panel, 1001 Forms of Suburbanization. North York and the suburbs Roger will discuss after me much further west in Brampton and Mississauga are what is known as the Greater Toronto Area, and they call into question any simple definition of the suburb. I will take on some of the historical work focusing on this one municipality of North York, while Roger will take us further afield to Brampton and Mississauga, where ideas of city and suburb are completely upended between the Amazon distribution centers, single-family homes, logistical enclaves, and apartment communities. In looking into the suburbs of history, this is the argument I kind of want to put forward today. Suburbanization in Toronto and Canada more broadly reflect a tension between the privatism of single-family homes and cars and more communal and collective forms of suburbanization. That was part of the movement towards rental and apartment living in North York especially. And with that in mind, I want to make 3 points. One, in a globalizing urban region, the suburb is as much a mindset and an ideology as it is a geographical locatable place. And in Toronto, it is difficult to say where something like a city ends and a suburb begins. Two, I also want to explore that mindset through the North American love affair with single family homes. And three, in the wake of Lewis Mumford's urban explosion, elements of what we think of as the suburb and the city often sit comfortably or not so comfortably side by side. This is especially the case in North York. Okay. The influential Canadian urban planner, theorist, and architect Humphrey Carver wrote that Canada's love affair with single-family homes reached back to rural ways of life and the homestead. Emigrating to Canada from England in the 1930s, Carver became a key figure on the housing and suburbs in the late 40s and up until his retirement in 1968. Much of his work as a planner culminated in this book, Cities in the Suburbs, where he grappled with two strong tendencies: mobility enabled by the automobile and the private life enabled by the mass building of small, affordable suburban homes. The results he found were suburban communities without community. His proposal was the multi-centered city, crudely illustrated here on the cover of the book, where suburbs would have focal points or downtowns, nodes in a growing region. The book foregrounded a suburban center strategy that would become part of Toronto's approach to planning suburbs in the 1970s and on. Carver believed that one of the problems was everyone wanted their own home and their own car, the very privilege here, or the ultimate privilege of capitalism and democracy. But this focus on the private life did not create a broader cohesive community and effectively kept out those who could not own their own homes and stranded those in car-dominated landscapes who could not afford or did not want cars. That the suburbs were exclusively focused on single-family homes, and not solely the suburbs, I should say. The city of Toronto is also very much dominated by neighborhoods of standalone houses. This had everything to do with what Carver believed was the legacy of the rural life that British immigrants brought with them to Canada. And if you see in that right-hand picture, this is what North York looked like around the 1910s. A house on its own piece of property, then in an area largely just dominated by farms. Amidst the last century of urbanization, it is an image that endures through Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City towards urban settlements in North America that privilege single-family home ownership and relegate apartment living to busy arterial roads on the periphery of suburban communities. The single-family home, Carver said, had been elevated to near religious status, embodied in the phrase, "my house, my castle." Carver even came up for a term in his work. He called it house lust. And here I'll quote him. He said, "A deep and primitive urge to possess and beautify a place that you can love." These were about the beautiful houses and the nuclear families that would occupy them. This image on the bottom there is really indicative of the traditional roles that went with these houses, the patriarch standing above it all, and the mother with a newborn. These are all images from what is now downtown North York, the suburbs of North York. These are all the houses from that area. Carver called the single family home the moral bedrock of urban society. Although beauty was not always on the top of the prospective homeowner's mind, particularly when housing became a mass production industry after the Second World War, the desire or lust to own and possess a house and a parcel of land remained strong. The mass-produced suburbs of the years following the Second World War and the many Levittowns were the subject of Carver's disdain, all this conformity. But we know that story, and we know that critique. Suburbs is a place of conformity. The development of Canada's suburbs have always shown that this critique was largely a false generalization, whether that was the self-built industrial suburbs of Toronto in the 1910s or 1920s, or the immigrant suburbs of today, two of which I want to talk about in a moment. The spirit of Carver's terms house lust and everything that goes with it continues to dominate in many of today's suburbs, but also dominates our thinking of what suburbs can be. Mobility, privatism, and the supposed freedoms, which were in fact wholly dependent on a vast publicly funded infrastructure. In contrast to this house lust was a more engaged modernism that was not just about design gestures, but it was thoroughly social. It was a thoroughly different way for people to live, work, and move in the periphery of cities. And I just want to show you two examples from North York. The first one being Flemington Park. So the urban historian Robert Fishman wrote that the post-World War II explosion of suburban house building has generally become associated with suburbia, but he said that that actually signaled the end of suburbia, if suburbs are understood as spaces of middle-class privilege. In Toronto, the 1950s and 1960s also marked a move away from house, well, not a move away from house building. House building was still going on, but there was also a parallel move towards building apartments in the suburbs. Whether intentional or not, it was already reflective of North America's unsustainable obsession with single-family home ownership. The urbanization of the suburbs, a key feature of many of today's North American desirable suburban communities, was often deeply connected to social and political reform, not simply a free market decision, as well as the influence globally of modernist architecture and urbanism. Two examples in the eastern part of North York here offer a more varied understanding of the suburb in North York. And I think also people looking at it, it might resonate with a Czech audience in terms of their resemblance to the sídliště. In Toronto, both places are immigrant neighborhoods. Many are surrounded by major arterial and busy roads and connected only to public transport through buses. Both places were praised by their architects and planners and modeled on the European suburbs like Vällingby in Stockholm. They upend our definition of the suburb. And if one of the defining features of urbanism is density, or is density and diversity, then places like Flemington Park and Thorncliffe Park are far more urban than many of their city counterparts. There are many more family-run businesses, usually priced out of the city center in favor of marijuana dispensaries, coffee shops, and high-end boutiques. In the spirit of the Garden City, they are also surrounded by greenery, as you can see here in Thorncliffe Park. Both places are located in what are traditional suburban areas, but as rental apartment communities upend our usual understanding of the suburb. But let's go back to that diagram of North York. So I showed you that plan at the very beginning, and this is what it turned into. And we can see here the tension in Toronto's suburbs between single family homes and high-rise. This is no longer a suburb in the strict sense anymore, as places further afield that Roger will talk about have developed and sprawled over the intervening 50 years since that plan that I first showed you. For the bird's eye view on the right, we can see both forms, high-rise and classic suburb. In a place one would be hard-pressed to call a suburb in such a landscape, but where the suburban mindset continues to play in these pockets over here, as opposed to here, this sort of the sort of dominant arterial road in Toronto called Yonge Street. Although this is a much richer neighborhood than the previous ones I showed you, it is still one of the most diverse neighborhoods in Toronto. And so, yeah, I just wanted to show you this to see this kind of tension between these two forms that really play out in the center of North York. So where have we come? The house on the left was the kind of that Humphrey Carver helped implement on a mass basis across Canada. But by his retirement in 1968, he began to question his long-held beliefs and saw himself searching for what he called a post-suburban habitat. He called for a move away from the universal aspiration to own a single-family house and look to more collective forms of housing that stressed interconnection with the surrounding landscape rather than separation. Carver could not have imagined how the suburbs have both changed and stayed the same. So the house on the right is actually on the street where I grew up and where my parents still live. When my daughter was very young and she was in the car with my grandparents, she remarked to them, "I didn't know that you had a hotel on your street." And this is, you know, in fact, reminiscent. I mean, I'm not sure a hotel would be my first reaction, but it is kind of reminiscent of the rural house that was in that earlier image. Rather a step, and this is instead of a step forward, this is 2021. It feels like a step back in time, both literally and symbolically. A desire for ever larger swaths of private space that need to be served by all forms of infrastructure. This is the fallacy of the single family home. There might be space for these houses. And although a house like this might be a dominant form of the suburbs in our mind, it is only one out of 1,001 forms of the suburbs. So with that historical overview and moving us into 2021, I'm going to pass it over to Roger.
Thank you, Steven. Let me share my screen. Thanks to the organizers for having us present here. It's really great to be in such a global environment from Siberia all the way to Canada. There is probably some northern aspect to be explored here, which we can't do, and I won't talk about it, but there's something we may also want to think about at some point. But it's a global question. I'm going to talk about that aspect. So moving from Toronto as a particular place where both Steven and I live, out into the globe, and then I will come back to the Toronto area throughout my talk, but also towards the end of it. So this is the context in which Steven and I have worked together. Also, we met at a project that he was involved in 2010, and have since been exchanging ideas and that have taken us around the world as to places that we have visited together. And some of them were part of that project that we had, which was funded by Canada's National Funding Agency, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, which produced a lot of empirical but also conceptual work over the years, and in particular this book series, which amongst others, the latest book is Steven's book, the monograph on the history of suburbs. This was interesting for us as an experience, because when we started the work and throughout this decade after 2010s, the suburbs were quite unfashionable. You may remember that another Torontonian, Richard Florida, had told us early in the century that all of this was going to go away and we would all live in creative cities downtown. And none of that did happen, but the wind was in our face as we studied global suburbanization. Suburbs were particularly the ones that Steven was talking about. The history of those suburbs in North America were considered unfashionable, and they were considered economically unattractive. Economies had to be downtown now. They were difficult to reach. There was no future for businesses in the suburbs. And most importantly, for that generation that carried the weight of public opinion over the last 10 or 15 years, the millennials preferred the city. It was empirically clear that they loved to be there. And maybe most importantly, climate change was considered to be living in suburbia. And so we had to deal with that to some degree. So this is a storyline of suburban crisis that we had to work against. And we were often considered to be propagators of suburbanism, which is of course not what we are, but we are analysts of suburbanism. But it continues, and this is just recently an exchange that I had a week ago with an Austrian colleague who works in New York, Gernot Wagner, who posted this on Twitter in German, so I have translated it below. The city begins when two houses share a wall. Suburbia begins when two single-family homes share a garden fence. This sounds good on Twitter, but it's actually complete nonsense. And as you already saw, of course, in Steven's presentation, this has to be looked at in more complex forms. Often Los Angeles is taken, and then in Wagner, when I confronted him on Twitter, responded to me, showing me an image of Los Angeles, which I know well because I did my dissertation on Los Angeles many years ago. And he said, oh yes, Los Angeles is indeed largely a suburban desertscape, and there is also bedroom or satellite neighborhoods. Well, you know, it all depends a little bit on the perspective. So if you think of Los Angeles as a suburban community, this is an image I took on the left flying into LA a few years ago. Just 5 kilometers away, you see the landscape on the right, which is not what you see on the left. So it's all a matter of perspective and scale, and it is the kind of different functions that cities perform and that we need to look at when we look at global suburbanization. And that has been the topic of our work ever since, whether it is in Los Angeles or in Prague or in Toronto. So at the core of all this has been this idea of Anglo-Saxon suburbanities. 90% of what is written about suburbs is still in English, and it is about those Anglo-Saxon suburbs. So when the term suburbs is used, that is what often is meant and what is being referred to. What we cannot talk about much about is, which comes to the fore now, which is very important in countries such as Australia, Canada, and the United States, is that this is now being seen in the light of settlement, non-indigenous settlement, and this is also immigrant settlement. I'm an immigrant to Canada, but I am not the typical immigrant that you have in Canada right now. The typical immigrant comes not from Europe like myself, but from places in Africa and mostly Asia. So the idea of who has this house lust, who is the settler in Canada now has also changed, and we need to look at that. Here is the view, and this is, I like the winter image. This is me flying into Toronto, flying over Mississauga, which is one of those outer suburbs, a city now of almost 800,000 people. We're waiting for the current census number, so I can't be sure. It's a dystopian landscape to some degree, but it's also, of course, symbolic of that kind of idea that everybody can have their little plot of land and all this. There are these two types in this city of Mississauga, as that Steven has already shown for North York. You have here the bungalow, the very typical with the long driveways and the not so green grass, but this was taken in April, and the condominium buildings, high-rise apartment buildings, now almost exclusively property in apartments, which means the condominium form of property. But as we get to this global view, moving away a little bit from the Canadian storyline itself, let's look at, this is in Brazil, and you could take this kind of picture anywhere from Monaco to Los Angeles to Mexico. But this is a typical suburban form, but it's important to say that I'm taking this picture from the roof of another high-rise apartment building. So you have these two forms as global forms everywhere. And we, of course, particularly those who've studied this from the European point of view, know where this is coming from. I don't need to explain this to this audience. The bar or the high-rise building is very much part of the history of suburbanization in Europe, but also then in Canada. This is my hometown in Frankfurt, Ernst May, in the 1920s, a very typical form of this kind of suburbanization. This is what it looks like today. It's still very much preferred as a housing area. And this is what it looks like all over Europe. I've chosen a picture from Tallinn, an Eastern European example, but it could be anywhere in France, in Germany, in Sweden, in England, in Scotland. It doesn't really matter, but we all know this form as one form of building cities outside. Whether we call that suburbanization or not is another topic. But what has now become of this is this general, ubiquitous, universal form of what we call massive suburbanization, which you see from Istanbul to Shanghai, around the world, and it is often built, of course, in these developmental states, much like what happened in Eastern Europe after 1945. Big state-driven programs of housing construction on the urban fringe. Here you have the market mostly involved in Gurgaon in India, outside of Delhi. There's a lot of interreferencing going on. So on the left, you have Kayasha here in Istanbul, on the European side of Istanbul, which references maybe Singapore, maybe Shanghai. There's a lot of the sameness that we see, but then you go to Shanghai and you see here Anting, the suburb that was built by German architects, and that looks very much like a southern German mid-sized town. So there's a lot of this sort of global interreferencing going on as these massive suburbs are being built. What we can say is that we live on a suburban planet. If we look at it from that sense, so cities become less densely populated as we become an urban planet, to fulfill Henri Lefebvre's idea of a completely urbanized society. So it's the age of the urban periphery. Again, a picture from this time the Asian side of Istanbul. None of this, what you look at here on this picture, existed at the beginning of this century, 20 years ago. This is all new, and this kind of urbanization is now familiar. Now, for what I have left in what I wanted to say, I want to quickly take you through the crisis of the urban periphery, and I think it is now through the lens of the crisis that we have to look at this. We have looked after the end of our program of funding. We looked at 3 types of crisis, one that Steven worked on transportation, but we also looked at political ecology and climate change, and we looked at presciently, because this was before the pandemic, at the impact of infectious disease on global suburbanization. And here I want to just, in closing, give you a few examples of how one of those suburbs has been tested by the COVID-19 pandemic, and that perhaps we can learn for other places too. This is the town of Brampton. Again, they had 650,000 people 4 years ago. And we now assume that they have about maybe 750 or 800,000 people. The important thing about this is how quickly those towns have grown, which is of course quite untypical for the European example, for most European examples, but that still drives Canadian suburbanization, immigration, and population growth. Here are some images from Brampton, these large suburban homes that Steven already showed, that are now marketed in submarkets of often immigrant communities. Here you have South Asian, Indian and Pakistani, mostly real estate agents selling to Indian and Pakistani newcomers. Our colleague and friend Murat Uçolu has studied that for this town of Brampton, and has found that there are credit schemes, private credit schemes, driving the mortgage politics around this building. So this is somewhat decoupled even from the old idea of what financed these kinds of suburbs. Quickly, the suburbs are changing. This is a former mayor of that city of Brampton who actually says we're not a bedroom community anymore. There's work in those suburbs, and there are different forms of consumption in these suburbs that now cater to new kinds of immigrant populations, and they have become a hotspot of the kind of the pandemic that we have now seen or experienced around the globe. Here you see a map on the left of Brampton, and the darker the map, the higher the infection rates. And you can see there is a concentration in the inner and outer suburbs of Toronto. And that has to do, of course, and this is just the map of Toronto again, and you see the concentration here also in the northwest and the northeast, in exactly those kinds of neighborhoods that Steven has brought to us earlier. And here also similar kinds of impressions. And here's the vaccine rollout, and which is also uneven, because you can see that the vaccines have mostly been administered to places that didn't need them, where the infection rates were the lowest, and the poorer new immigrant populations in those suburbs did not get vaccinated right away. That has now been fixed to some degree, which I don't have time to talk about. But what I wanted to end with is this idea, again, that the suburbs are not what they appear to be. I already talked about the diversity in those suburbs. I also want to talk about the fact that they're not residential suburbs in the classical sense. While you have this residential landscape, you also have companies like Amazon producing the suburban space there. And here you see in Brampton and Mississauga, all the Amazon fulfillment centers, the warehouses where the packages are being put together for the deliveries. They're all in those suburbs, in those same suburbs. And the residential populations in those new immigrant suburbs, they also are, of course, the workforce in those places. And they have become hotspots. Here you see 3 of those. I took this screenshot yesterday. 3 of the fulfillment centers are currently closed because of COVID, because the workforce has been infected. So I want to leave it with that, to say that when we study the suburbs, Now look at it globally, look at it in crisis, look at the suburbs as an emerging condition. And this is, I hope, an ongoing conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steven and Roger. It was really an overview of variability of the word suburbanism, and I would ask Konstantin to continue, please.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, let me introduce opposite pole of suburban planet, and it is not just as geographical definition. It's another stage of suburban processes. Well, I would like to start from paradox. Oh, sorry. Yeah. If we try to see at the urbanization in Siberia through the optic of statistic and legal document, we will not find suburbs. Until today, there is no any definition of suburbs in statistical and legal paper. All municipal territory are divided into rural and urban small region. All life conditions in suburbs are very close to rural ones. I mean, tax, cost of service, and others. Therefore, suburbs very often is recognized like a rural territory, and the process of suburbanization recognized like a rural population growth. Very important from my point of view that there is no stable designation and self-designation for the inhabitants of the suburbs and everyday life in the language of power and academic texts also. Well, suburbanization in Siberia has no long history. Pre-industrial suburbs, or more correctly, rural settlements near city's border, didn't form a specific suburb zone. Most of them was absorbed by the urban space during Soviet urbanization. Other settlements, which situated near city but outside of its border, developed like a typical rural settlements. The dachas was the specific way of suburb growth in Soviet period. It was not way of life, but it was a way of domestic economic and recreation. It was seasonal temporal houses with a small plot of land for agriculture. Modern stage of suburbanization in Siberia has begun in the early of 2000s. In this decade, the population growth had started in suburb zone. Initially, it looks like as an agglomeration sprawl by the migration from the far territory of Irkutsk Oblast, as well as north of Siberia. But to the end of the decade, the growth of specific suburb zone became apparent. Important that Soviet and post-Soviet form of suburbs developed very closely now. We can find both types of the same suburbs territory. Very often, new suburb settlements are registered like dachas, and we have new content with the old name. But from the power state point of view, this is dachas, but not permanent suburb settlements. I can constant that suburbanization in the Eastern Siberia realizes with the different types of settlement. Actually, in suburbs of Irkutsk, we can find every type of suburb settlements which pointed in this slide. First of all, Catech Village. Probably it was the first type of suburb settlement which appeared in the end of the 1990s and early 2000s. And now this type is quite spread in Irkutsk, in the Kursk region, and also in other Siberian region. For example, in Krasnoyarsk Krai, Krasnoyarsk territory, Krasnoyarsky Krai in Russian, and in other territories of Eastern Siberia. The next form, chronological next form of suburbanization was a reconstruction of the old village. It was most important way of suburbs growth in the 2000s. But now the role of this way of suburbanization is decreased. Now most of old village near the region capital has built reconstruction, and now this way, as I say, is decreased. Next form, which I call it semi-squatting. I must say several special words regarding this form of suburbanization growth in Siberia. It's not classical squatting. Most part of migrant from the city buys the land absolutely legal. But building houses at this land is prohibited. As a result, we have a strange situation, which I call it like semi-squatting. Legal buying of land and illegal using of it for housing building. As a result, the much of the suburbs of this type of suburbs is illegal. Next, dachas. Soviet dacha was not Western suburbs. It was a season, temporal housing, not for permanent residence, but for recreation and agriculture. But now, very often, Soviet dacha rebuilt for the round eras living. Next form, which call it in Russian mikrorayons. It's look like H city, small H city. It is chronological last form of suburbanization in our region. First of all, I must say that I should say that it's not typical H cities. It is closer to the Soviet idea of microrayon, but without of any social and other infrastructure. Now we have 3 such microrayons near the Irkutsk, and actually it's more often described as a sleeping quarters than H city. Finally, a very specific form of inner suburbanization into the urban area. There are large areas of one-store houses in Russian city called private housing sector or частный сектор in Russian. During last decade, I observed intensive processes of reconstruction in this area by the inner suburbs model. And now several pictures with the various type of suburb settlement. Here you can see cottage village or simply cottage, which building by a gated communities model. Note to the picture in the left corner. This is settlement called Milovibi is absent in the official document because this settlement is dacha de jure. So we see a large settlement with more than 200 inhabitants, but officially it's only dachas. Next. This slide, you can see reconstruction process of the old village. In the picture in the right corner demonstrates the process of the rebuilding, reconstruction old rural houses. for the new cottage for new suburban permanent living. And in the picture in the left corner, we can see the result of the similar process in another village near Irkutsk. Well, dacha rebuildings. There are dachas in the Angara River bank. The old dachas are under the yellow arrows. You can see 2 points here, small houses, and here small houses. And other builds on these photos are rebuilt dachas for around houses, around here living. Next, the form of suburbanization, which I call semi-squatting. The building of agrarian lands in this picture. You can see the open field with new one-family houses here. Both photos made in the area which about 10 years ago used for the potato growing. So it's this is a situation which I call it semi-squatting, because most of inhabitants of these houses bought the land absolutely legal, but the houses are illegal. Well, next, a couple of pictures of microrayon. This microrayon, which called Современник, is situated at 2 kilometers from Irkutsk. And as you see, the microrayon are built in the open field, and there are no any social or service infrastructure here. It's just 4 floors blocks in the open field, and there are no ones here. Finally, this slide is a reconstruction of the private housing sector. The old build, which looks like rural housing, is in the middle of the photo, and near of them, in the right side of picture, the new build in the center of the Omsk city, which constructed by the same owners on near the old houses. Well. Now, several words regarding the dynamic of suburbanization. In this slide, I try to show 2 regions of Eastern Siberia with rapid suburbs growth. I used example of Republic of Buryatia and Irkutsk Oblast. During 15 years, the population of suburbs in the Republic of Buryatia had grown up to 2.7 times, and in the Irkutsk Oblast about 2 times. Red lines in the my table. I show these regions because it demonstrated 2 ways of suburbs growth. In the Buryatia case, we have intensive migration from the rural parts of region to the regional capital. In the case of Irkutsk Oblast, the suburb is growth by the migration from the regional capital mostly. If we look more detail the suburbs of Irkutsk, we can see rapid growth of population in the most settlement. You can see that suburb population grows up from the 14% to the more than 20% of the regional capital population. Next slide demonstrates the dynamic of population growth in Irkutsk suburbs. As we can see, the population decreased just in the 3 settlements, and all of these settlements red line in my table, all of these settlements are situated quite far from region center. It's about 130 kilometers. And in other cases, we have growth of population, and in several cases, it's very rapid growth of population. Well, and now I try to make some conclusion for my presentation, and I try to show main line of suburbanization in Eastern Siberia. The suburbanization in Eastern Siberia has high dynamic in the last 2 decades. The growth didn't stop despite 2 economic crises which took place during this period. Various types of suburban settlement from the different epoch, I mean Soviet and post-Soviet epoch, are developed at the same time, at the same territory. We have a very interesting mixed in our region in this process. And of course, there is no official recognized suburbs. It means there are no suburbs by statistical data and legal document, but actually we have a very intensive process of suburbanization. So that's all, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Konstantin. If you can stop the sharing, and I will continue.
Thank you.
Please, all the people can use chat, and there are some questions and responses already in the chat. And I'll follow with my presentation. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to follow with the topic from Central and Eastern Europe, and I would like to speak about 3 different topics which are presented here in an outline of the paper. So I would like to start with maybe the history, short history and the form of suburbanization, and maybe also the future. So this is the question of time. And then I will show you results of our project on the limitation of suburban zones in the Czech Republic, and will be about scope and extent of suburbanization. And the last point will be on different forms of suburban mobilities. First, I would ask what suburbanization is, especially in the context of our country, where the topic and also the term is quite new from 1990s, and it was quite difficult to imagine even what suburb is in our settlement system, and it is very connected to the beginnings and the end of suburbanization. What is quite often questions from not only scientists and scholars, but also from the public and from the politicians, etc. I'd like to show you part of our research, which is mapping of suburbs in the hinterland of Prague. This is one part of our mapping, and you can see individual villages on the photos, and then there are new development, under construction and finished houses in this part of eastern surrounding of the city, and this is more in detail. And you can recognize, considering the form of suburban development, that there are very small villages like this one, Dobrochovice, with less than 100 people formerly, and then a small scale development of infills and 1-2 streets. But there are on the other hand, quite extensive suburban construction, especially in case of in form of detached family houses. And what is very rare, but I try to show you even this case, is a totally new settlement outside existing villages and towns, which is, for example, this one, locality Nakukli. I want to compare this contemporary development of suburbanization in Prague metropolitan region with industrial era, and you can see here a map of the 19th and 20th century with construction, and this is the detail construction of new development before and after 1877, and you can recognize very similar form of new development, what is now inner city of Prague, like Pangrácz, Podolí, Michle, and these areas are very similarly this scattered development, no big carpet housing construction. So this is something what is very similar in 19th century, like for contemporary suburbanization, and we can even compare pictures from this aerial pictures from the interwar period. You can see something what maybe American can titled streetcar suburb, because this is the terminal station of tramway, and Spořilov, English style garden city, which is quite comparable to the largest Czech suburb, Jesenice, on the left hand side. And the same we can compare waves of residential development in Prague from the beginning of so-called Greater Prague, when Prague began to be capital city of Czechoslovakia, and you can see large scale housing construction in between of two wars, and then socialist construction, especially during the 70s, with very intensive development, especially of housing estates, and then suburbanization with the peak around 2007, 2008. And you can see on the example of net migration rate. So this is a migration increase in three different parts of Prague metropolitan area, and this is from the end of 1980s, and you can see something like take off of the airplane and very intensive increase of suburban migration till the economic crisis 2008 and 9. But still now these two adjacent districts of Prague East and Prague West have more than 2% per year growth, which is quite intensive increase. So to sum up the first point or the first question, the most typical form of contemporary suburbanization is small-scale development or housing projects, sometimes even do-it-yourself construction. But we have also the name suburbs or Vorstadt or předměstí in Czech in case of our cities, not only Prague, but other cities connected to 19th century industrial and residential suburbs. And today, very exceptionally, we have something like let's say this LA carpet development of autonomous settlement and unconnected to former villages. And one maybe consequence for the theoretical discussion is that maybe the most important paradigm during the last quarter of the 20th century. It was Van den Berg, Cashier Hall, and these people who mentioned stages of urban development. This is probably not stages, but these are urbanization and suburbanization, two historical processes which jointly and permanently form our cities and metropolitan regions. And even now, not only suburbanization, but urbanization, counter-urbanization, other processes are important in our settlement system. Then I prepared two slides about the scope or extent of suburbanization in Czechia, and we first define for our research the term of suburbanization as a migration process. This is only, of course, residential suburbanization, and we consider residential suburbanization as out-migration from the urban environment to suburban settlements. We can even there define other urbanization processes. What is interesting that this with different target and source of migration are interesting for our research. And it is because of tension between the former and new environment, between former and new residents. So one of the topics are cohabitation of the former villagers and new suburbanities. By the way, the most important in case of the scope or extension is intra-urban mobility, but this is not so interesting for us because no tension is created there. And this is the map with the results, and we delimited all municipalities with at least some intensity of housing construction and in migration from the core cities, which are these 130 cities in Czech Republic with more than 10,000 inhabitants. But you can recognize that there are not so many suburban towns and villages. This is more or less 1/5 of the settlement structure in Czech Republic. And even more, only 1/3 of them are newcomers to the municipality. So altogether, we can say that this is something like 5% of the total population in Czechia are these suburbanities who move to suburban places, and where in this municipality is considerable housing construction. So when we compare it to American, and what for example Roger said, that there is something like dominance of periphery, that we are in the age of urban periphery. So yes, there is huge development, not only residential suburbanization, but also logistic, etc. And many places are influenced by suburbanization, but this is not so many people living there in Czech Republic. And the last topic is suburban social and spatial mobilities, and I would like to connect somehow not only migration, the suburban migration, but then consequences in social status or social transformation, social mobility, and also commuting and daily rhythms within the Czech suburbs. And I'd like again use this analytical table, this tool, and we perceive change of social environment partly as a consequence of these urbanization processes. And this is when we use this Giddens theory of structuration, and this is something like mutual and permanent adjustment or structuration of local environment, and we can describe it using our research, especially on a social environment and social climate, etc., together with Petra Špačková, and then competition and cooperation of former residents and newcomers, and this tension between form and newly demanded and required function activities are very interesting for us. And it was quite surprising, and against this suburban myth, I would say that there are quite huge cohesion, especially inside new suburban localities, and it is comparable, for example, with villa neighborhoods within the Prague city. Of course, another change is demographic change, because this is net migration rate to Prague East district, and you can compare two different lines. One is for the 2004, second is 12 years later, and this is even changing, and now more children and older parents than during the initial stage of suburbanization moved to the hinterland of the city. But nevertheless, the changes of especially demographic or age structure is visible from this bachelor thesis by Stefanek, that there are quite huge changes of individual generations with huge impact on polarization of social structure, and then demand for specific services, especially kindergartens and elementary schools. Another example from our applied research when we delimited Prague metro region is this use of mobile phone data, and this is mapped for average daily time spent by citizens of individual municipalities around Prague in the city. And it was quite surprising for us that the area with the intensive use of Prague environment and services is quite narrow. And for example, this is 5 and more hours spent by inhabitants of the municipality in Prague. Then the second circle is for 2 to 5. Yeah, and it was quite surprising. And we then used the data for another, this is master thesis of Jiří Jakub, and he described new micro-regional autonomy of especially the towns around the city, which are mostly between 5 to 10,000 people, and they created during the morning something like work, commuting to work areas, and then during the afternoon even smaller, quite autonomous districts or areas which are less and less dependent on Prague. And we call it, or we can call it something like induced deconcentration of jobs. And this and other research of mobile phones can say that there is something like emergence of micro-regional commuting links and the concentration of services with a specific demographic and economic structure of new suburbanities. And these new journeys for services take place over shorter distance than 10 or 20 years ago. And there are quite new patterns of work commuting. And we can then think about the connection between migration and daily mobility in the current settlement system. So this is something what we can call induced deconcentration of jobs. I'd like to conclude with several. I have prepared two slides with conclusion. Generally, we started with more theoretical questions or urbanization and suburbanization, and we said that probably these are not in contemporary settlement system stages of urban development, but more form which can function together. Then we would not search maybe for the beginning and the end of suburbanization. We can see even suburbs in the old map of Mesopotamia, We have suburbs of 19th century, industrial suburbs. We have interwar suburbs in Czech settlement system. And maybe this is more proper to use the Chicago school processes and Chicago school concentric model by Burgess, or the centripetal and centrifugal concept by Charles Colby, geographer from Chicago from 30s. And then probably there is quite huge interdependence between these several types of mobilities. We didn't mention till now international migration, which is maybe the most important migration stream into Czech Republic and into our cities. And then internal migration, commuting and daily rhythms are influenced by this kind of migration. To conclude, we can say that the metropolitan region of the capital, I mean Prague, will probably not expand, but more concentrated development in the vicinity, in the close vicinity of Prague, is more probably. Maybe also the impact of COVID-19 will lead to reduction of spatial mobility and maybe higher use of home offices, and another reduction or reduce of commuting, and the more activities will be realized locally or regionally or macro-regionally. And this is important that these tangential or micro-regional movements, and probably they will be strengthened in the future. About foreigners, till now, and we did some investigation of suburbanization of foreigners, and probably do not have much tendencies to suburbanize now. But on the other hand, like gentrifiers, they increase, some of them increase the prices and trends within the city, and push part of domestic middle class from the inner city to other parts of metropolitan region, not only to housing estates, but also outside of the city with good transport accessibility to Prague. And all these processes will probably strengthen the micro-regional autonomy of selected centers, especially in the daily supply of services as goods, which are now connected in form of teachers, new services in hospitals, new retail, hypermarkets, etc. But sport and leisure time activities, this is something that is connected to new suburbanities outside the city, and probably will strengthen this micro-regional autonomy of towns, especially towns outside the city. So thank you for your attention, and now we can have general discussion on all of the 4 presentations, and we can even use chat, and I don't know how many questions and comments are in chat while I've been presenting, so we can check it now, and we can even open the general discussion, and the floors is not only on presenting, but for all open. So let's start the discussion, and we have something like maybe 30 minutes for general discussion. If you know something what is worth to answer from the chat, so any of the presenter can start. I can see that there were some reaction on the first presentation, and then there was one comment from Poland on the non-existing definition of suburban place. Maybe we can even start with that. So I know only one country with the official definition, which is United States, and I know that there is something like 55 of suburban settlements. Well, so floor is yours, and please don't hesitate to ask and comment. So
maybe I can, because I can start, because
yes,
I've been addressed in a couple of those. I just want to acknowledge, I didn't want to start typing into the chat because it distracts from me. I can't listen to Martin, and but I think these are really good points and good questions. And I don't know whether we're right now in the position to even answer them. And I think that, thanks Alina for, the reminder of, Stuttgart and Weißenhof and all that. These are important other examples, and is really, it's important to keep the conversations about the richness of those kinds of designs alive, to not always begin at, from scratch again when we talk about those things, but to remember that we've had these discussions for more than a century, and things are, not new in that sense. We are not the first people thinking about those phenomena of how to connect the traditional city with what used to be the countryside, which in the past was a difference between two models, the industrial and the pre-industrial, the capitalist and the pre-capitalist. All of that was challenged through the socialist century, after 1917. And so you had a different, very deliberate way of connecting what used to be the city to what used to be the countryside. And this was particularly difficult in countries like the Soviet Union, which was a majority rural country. Not that France was not rural at the time, but the industrialization of the Soviet Union had to do with the urbanization of the Soviet Union, just as the industrialization of China had to do with the urbanization of China over the last 3 or 4 decades. So these are processes that we have studied in many ways, and we can't always be surprised again by the same things happening again. So what we need to do is, when we look at, that's why I like the idea of looking at it through the idea of crisis, to look at what is going on through what currently is the problem. And so I suggested, and that is, so I'm making the space now to answer, the question of what is happening now with the crisis that we have faced. There is a crisis, there are these two crises. The one crisis is climate change, and we have to come to terms with it. And Elon Musk and his electric cars will not save us. We have to find ways to move people around, to move goods around, to stay connected, and to have sustainable settlement patterns. And that's the task that is ahead of us. And how suburbanization fits into that. What is the tenure? Is it privately owned? Is it owner occupied, or is it rental? These questions need to be asked in the context of climate change. But I want to focus on the other crisis that has now, looks like it is a momentary or a current crisis that affects settlement patterns, which is the pandemic. And here are these two questions. Katarzyna's question about the impacts of the pandemic on residential mobility patterns, and Adela's questions on, on the physical infrastructure and how that is being affected through this crisis. Well, I don't know. I mean, we have to see. We're in the middle of this still, but there are a few things that we can say. As there is no map of Europe where you cannot find Prague in 1300, and Prague is still there. The city where I come from, Frankfurt, has been, a city since the 14th century. There is no map of Germany where Frankfurt does not exist. It's always been there. So the idea that Frankfurt or Prague will go away because of a pandemic, that's not going to happen. They survived the plague in the Middle Ages, many wars, the terrible world wars of the 20th century. All of this happened. Capitalism, socialism, you know, we're still living in those cities. And the same is happening in Toronto. Unless something much more terrible happens, those cities will be there, and they will be central places that have functions that central places have. And so the reference to the Chicago School is correct. But we also know that the Chicago School is only one model of explaining what cities are. Because there's also the Los Angeles School, and they, you know, and other potential schools. There are now, you know, schools in Asia that talk about mega regions, and they have very little to do with what the Chicago School used to say. In Europe, the better model to explain what's going on is the in-between city, Tom Sieverts's idea of the Zwischenstadt. And those kinds of models have begun to explain what is now the world in which we actually live. And those Amazon warehouses and the infrastructures that connect them to your doorstep, to where you want to consume something from Amazon, those networks exist as the real city in which we live. And whether you live in a little village with an extended suburban ring, or you live in the center of Toronto in a high-rise condominium building, doesn't really matter. You live in the same urban fabric, in the same urban society. And when we go forward to meet those challenges of climate change and infectious disease, and there are other challenges too, but these are the predominant ones. When we want to meet them, we need to start meeting these challenges from the real existing pattern of this in-betweenness, post-suburban, extended urban landscape, because we cannot pretend that this does not exist, right? So that is, I think, for me, the starting point to answer this question. But empirically, what we can say already, yes, there has been a shift. There has been a shift in many places around the world. In Toronto, there has been an incredible boom in the suburbs, in real estate markets, and in small towns. People have been moving away from city centers, and they have been looking for bigger other places to live. The problem with that sort of idea that this process is driven by consumer demand is that this was always the story of the suburbs. This is the house lust story. This is the idea that it's individual consumers driving this process. And now the process is driven by individual consumers looking for more space so they can have a home office to work from home. Never in these narratives have we heard from who is forced to live in particular places. So who is driven out of the city by gentrification, rather than choosing to move out, who is driven out of the city by gentrification. On the other hand, those essential workers that we know have lived in our suburbs, in our inner suburbs in Toronto, for example, they have no choice. They can't just pick up and leave because they don't have the economic means to buy a big house outside of the city. And they are tied to the kinds of jobs that give them employment, the low-paid service type jobs that only exist in the city. You cannot just move to the countryside and work in an Amazon warehouse. It's not possible. So you are stuck to some degree. You have now become captive to this form of urbanization or suburbanization, and you're stuck there. So this idea that everybody is moving away because of COVID is a limited idea, right? It only some people who have the privilege to make that move can be counted here. The others are stuck where they are. And so we need to see how that plays out. And we need to see whether the kinds of cities we built over the last 20 years, ever smaller units that are sold in financialized marketplaces in Istanbul, in Shanghai, in Toronto, maybe not so much in Prague. But Prague has another issue to deal with, which is the Barcelona issue, which is the tourism issue, right? Will the tourism come back? What will be the effect of tourism on the land markets? Will Airbnbs come back? Will those kinds of new forms of housing have an impact on those urban land economies? that is an additional question for cities like Prague, Toronto, Barcelona, who are tourist centers, which are tourist centers. But that is not necessarily in the questions that have been asked here. So thanks, I've spoken a long time, but this is really very much on my mind right now.
Okay, thank you. Any reaction? So this is another form of mobility, by the way, tourism. We didn't suggest it. Yeah, so another maybe force which is responsible for the transformation of residential function, definitely in Prague, and the rising prices of apartments within the city center. So you are right. And maybe one more, and this is something like studentification. So many, not only tourists, but what this German school named as transitory urbanities. Yeah, so there are more than tourists, but some our city. I remember Tartu, for example, but in our case, Olomouc and other, maybe Brno, are full of students, and this is quite powerful and important portion of, I don't know if they are residents or temporary residents. So there are a lot of these mobilities and these transitory urbanities. It's a very useful concept for us. Well, I don't know if something about the pandemic. So we tried to have at least comments on pandemics, and in my view, I would agree with Roger that there will be definitely demand for something more like a home office, maybe one more room, or maybe even shared point where suburbanities or people living outside the city can work. And maybe there will be an offer from the real estate agencies on that. We will see. So
I could say something too
yes,
about the pandemic and its connection to the suburb. I think I really completely agree with everything Roger is saying. I wanted to highlight a couple of this importance of thinking of the logistical and the infrastructural suburb and the suburb in its non-residential aspects, because this has really come to the fore. As Roger mentioned, there was a privilege to be able to stay in your home during the pandemic. That was a privilege that wasn't afforded to everybody, and it depended on the labor and the infrastructure of others, and it often depended on the labor and the infrastructure of suburban areas. And so I think in going back to this point about our virtual spaces, often the virtual world or the virtual urban space really complicates our distinctions between city and suburb, because can we still make that distinction when we live half the time online? And in order to live online, we see it as this kind of, our life in the cloud, but it's dependent on immense amounts of infrastructure, not just in the surrounding suburban regions, but globally in terms of data centers and in addition to these warehouses. So I think, crises always let us see the networks better. And in this case, it's allowed us to see the infrastructure networks. And so I think it's really interesting to bring that into the suburbanization discussion, is logistics and infrastructure. And I think, the climate change and pandemic, in a way, they're not two separate things. They're completely interconnected, because in a lot of the early, information society prophets of the 70s and early 80s were making claims for working from home. It never really, and they were often saying this will reduce congestion, this will reduce pollution. It never was realized in the way that those information gurus wanted it to. But now it sort of comes to realization during the pandemic. the other thing which is really interesting is in going back to why historical forms of suburbanization are interesting and outside of just the single family model is the focus on healthy suburbs in terms of access to green space, access to places where fresh air and can circulate, which was like a really key point of the modernist idea of building and urbanization. It's come about again. And, you know, where COVID hits really hard in Toronto tends to be in older apartment buildings where there isn't access to green space. People don't have backyards and they don't have, and that has a number of implications. Access to communal green spaces that people can walk to. And so all of these things which were like, you know, the trade of modernist architecture and urbanism, and now really also comes to the fore again, where we see a huge divide. I talked about that divide between like the single family home and the apartment. Well, that divide is not just a divide that looks visually, but then was also a divide that was felt during the pandemic. I just wanted to say that, and the how some of those things are connected both historically, but also in terms of like where we're going and thinking about, because if we continue to use a kind of restricted definition of suburbs as single family houses, we miss a lot of important things about how the urban region functions.
Thank you. There are two questions specifically on Toronto. So one is from Maťo Šveda from Bratislava, and he is asking about the urbanization of suburbs concept. Maybe is based on this transit-oriented transportation concept, and another one is about it's probably for Roger, post-pandemic housing inequalities. If there, I think even now it was quite inequalized, because if I compare, so I'm living in suburbs, and probably it's better to share several rooms and the garden in case of this pandemic situation than when you compare with my colleagues, and most of them asked to be present at the faculty because of 2 rooms with school children, and these inequalities, even not maybe inequalities in salaries, but this is something like housing or space inequality. So there's two questions for maybe for Roger and for Steven about this urbanization of suburb. If you can.
I think I already to some degree addressed, and so did Steven, the question of inequalities. I think what is one of the big discussion points here in North America generally, which is linked to that question, which is really probably one of the big differences to the conversation in Europe. And then maybe, Konstantin has similar experiences in Russia's north, but we have a lot of discussion now about long-term injustice of land ownership. So that includes for us the indigenous question that could be similar in some parts of Northern Europe, and with the indigenous populations there, and the tremendous unevenness of ownership rates between white and black Canadians, and that's more of an issue in the United States, but it's also an issue in Canada. And we have, as a national conversation, that is where we have to go to think about inequities in those historical terms, in fundamental terms. White people, white settlers like myself, have on average been doing much better after arriving in Canada than Black Canadians have. And Black Canadians have been in Canada from the beginning of settlement in Canada. And now, of course, there are also many African Canadians as part of the immigrant population. And statistically, they haven't been doing as well in terms of home ownership. and all that. So I think it's important to recognize that settlement in suburbanization is very much tied up with this question of settlement and immigration in Canada, and that may be much different in many European countries. But in terms of the other two issues that have been raised here about resilience and resilient environments, and question of whether planners can produce a better suburban environment in terms of the challenges of climate change. I think in Toronto, the experience is that over the last 20 years, we've had a planning regime that was put in place by the regional government, which is the provincial government, which has attempted to solve this issue in the following way. They have created so-called places to grow, and there are about 20, 25 of those in southern Ontario, which is the urbanized area of Toronto and Hamilton. So the idea was to produce many of the kinds of environments that Steven showed us for North York, where you have basically this two-form urbanization. You have suburban often, or old village centers, reminds me a lot of Konstantin's slides. Old village and town centers that are built up often in high-rise form while they're surrounded by single-family homes. And the idea is to concentrate often around public transit, but often also around automobile infrastructure, to concentrate in these 20 to 25 places. One of the criticisms of that has been that those places are all administrative or residential centers, and they ignore the fact that much of suburbanization is in fact around these what people have called industrial megazones, employment megazones that exist around the airport, around our suburban universities, and they often are not seen as growth centers in that way, and the infrastructures are not growing alongside with that kind of suburbanization. And the opposite of those growth centers is a regional green belt. So we have a large green belt, much larger than the green belt in London or the green belt in Frankfurt. In those more city-oriented green belts, we have one that spans basically all of the agricultural landscape of the entire southern part of the province. And the idea is that in that green belt, no development shall happen. So you have this strange, and to some degree that has changed the policy of development, or the actual development in the province, because now 40% of all building that happens has to happen in multi-family units. So in those growth centers outside of the Greenbelt, in regional and rural communities everywhere, all development, 40%, 50% now of all such development needs to be different from single family homes. And that has happened to some degree, and we have to see how that will continue to happen. I want to end with, in terms of the environmental impact, all of that depends to some degree on how Canadians will become more Asian or more European in their daily habits. And I have, after having lived here for 30 years, huge doubts. Both Steven and I are people who use our bicycle almost daily. We have, a lot of us, do that. But, and in the COVID crisis, all of a sudden you had hundreds, thousands of people buying bikes. You cannot buy a bicycle in Toronto. It's impossible right now. And they have opened up some city streets on Saturdays and Sundays for use only for bicycles. And that has led to a bicycling boom. But in reality, it is not Amsterdam and Copenhagen. It is not Stockholm. What is happening is that most of this bicycling is recreational. People don't use the bicycle to go to work. People use the bicycle to have fun on the weekend, to take the family to parks, to the waterfront and all that, and to move around for recreational purposes. And when this is all over, and when people do other things again, and they forget that they have the bicycle in the garage, I fear that we will go back to a terrible, terrible overload of automobile mobility in Toronto as in other North American cities. And nothing will have been learned. We will not have been turned into Amsterdam, Copenhagen, or Stockholm in this crisis. So we have not learned anything. Planners have not provided enough guidance. We have not created the infrastructure for these kinds of developments, and we will fall back into a now electric form of automobility that will last at least another 30 or 50 years before that all collapses. Yeah, it's my prediction. I won't be around in 50 years, but this is my prediction. So, you know, since this is recorded, maybe in 50 years, some student of urban planning can say Kyle was right or Kyle was wrong. So that for me is a personal tragedy that apparently we're not learning enough, fast enough, and we're not making those kinds of changes to create more resilient city and suburbs in Toronto. And I don't know whether Steven shares that pessimistic view, but that is how I come out of this pandemic, with that kind of idea.
Yes. Well, I can see one maybe criticism or comment, and it is by my colleague Pepa Novotný, and he's here. It is difficult to look globally at suburbanization processes without acknowledging high dynamics and specific forms of changes around cities in global south. Yes, and I was thinking about this just when Konstantin presented these two cases of Irkutsk and Ulan-Ude, and I just thinking about continuity of this, what Ernst Burgess called this inner zone where immigrants came around the core of the city, so something like transition zone. And it is very different in case of South global mega cities like I don't know, cities in India or Sao Paulo, but it is quite similar with Ulan-Ude when and maybe Ulaanbaatar when more rural people came to the suburb, and in comparison with Prague and maybe also with Toronto and other cities in global north, this transition zone it's probably in other parts of the city, maybe in the inner city for Prague, definitely. So this is quite interesting question, if there is something like continuity of this transition zone or incoming zone in the world. So why there is cheap land outside Sao Paulo, and why it is not so cheap around Toronto, and why this gradient of socio-economic status is different in global global south and global north. So I would agree, but we have no space to invite another speaker. So I just maybe ask Konstantin if you can compare why in Irkutsk is this deconcentration, suburban deconcentration, and why in Ulan-Ude, which is not so far from it, it is opposite. Just switch on the microphone, please.
Sorry,
yes.
I tried. The point is that Irkutsk was a very industrial and administrative center in Soviet period. And Irkutsk region, Irkutsk Oblast, have a very intensive migration process in the middle and in the second half of 20th century. So to the present time, Irkutsk is very high level urbanization region of Siberia and of Russia. And we have opposite situation in Buryatia, in Ulan-Ude, because Ulan-Ude during the century, 20th century, was the center of agrarian region. and we have not completed Soviet urbanization. It was not natural situation because agrarian population in Buryatia not intensive migration to Ulan-Ude, and last 2 decades population from agrarian region, agrarian lands of Republic of Buryatia are migration to regional center. So we have in the same macro region around Baikal Lake, we have the 2 opposite situation, and I think that this is a good idea to use model of global use and global north for one region, Baikal region, because for Irkutsk we have situation closer to global north with deconcentrate migration from the regional center to suburbs, and the nearest region Ulan-Ude, between Irkutsk and Ulan-Ude, just 400 kilometers. For Siberia it's around the corner. So in Ulan-Ude we have situation with concentrated population like in Ulaanbaatar. So it's really very interesting models, very interesting compare for studying suburban process in Siberia and Russia as a whole. Well, if I answer for your question.
Mm-hmm. So this is a level of urbanization and industrial development. Okay, I can see one question by my PhD student Greta Kukeli, but I don't know if I understand it well. So can you, Greta, translate it to us and to whom it's focused on? So it is about the planning. If you can see it. So I don't know if it is about Czech planning practices or something more global.
If I can say, it
yes.
was a general question, but I believe Mr. Kiel answered it when he said that indeed planners are not learning as fast from the challenges and therefore they are not producing these teachings in the territory. But if anyone is willing to see some other insights for more specific localities, such as the Czech suburbanization or the Russian one, I'd be very interesting. And I believe others also would be. So that my question was generally how planners are, concerning how planners are addressing these areas and better how they should address them to make these areas sustainable, but also like to respond to the crises that are taking place. Not only the pandemic, even though the pandemic actually showed us that there is a crisis of public spaces, there is a crisis of diversity, but more in terms of how these areas should be made resilient, just in general lines.
Can I just add to this? Yes, I tried to answer this previously, and this is really a wonderful question, and there's so much more to say. I'm a strong believer in the green belt as a potential growth management tool. So that is what planners can do. So, you know, you can implement appropriate growth management tools. I think that is possible. We cannot let cities grow, suburbs grow the way they used to. So we have to do that. We have, after the pandemic, the most important measure for me will be to re-strengthen public transit. But as we know from countries like Switzerland, which has a fantastic public transit system, it has contributed to sprawl in Switzerland, right? Because now you can live in some remote valley somewhere in in a little village in Switzerland and you can be in Zurich in 20 minutes because the public transit system is so perfect, right? You don't have to drive, but you can still live remotely. So we need to think about that as what planners can do, transportation planners, is to build better and to invest better into public transportation systems, to connect us better and to connect the suburbs to the suburbs better, to give up the city-centered Chicago school type, city-centered model of urbanization, and to connect the people from where they, both Steven and I work in suburban universities. There are barely any connections from those universities to other suburban areas. It's very poor, and these kinds of things can be done better. But I also think it needs a more fundamental rethink of what some Austrian colleagues have been calling the imperial mode of living, which is that we tend to like to think of ourselves as environmentalists, and planners think that they are planning for environmentally sound and resilient cities. But people get into their SUV, into their car to buy, some milk, or to do all kinds of drive their children to school. Those kinds of things are now everybody's habit, and this habit is supported by a huge, complex industrial system that is not easy to topple. Whatever the system is in which we live, whether it is the Western style liberal capitalism or whether it's the Eastern Chinese system of capitalism, those things are very difficult to change. So if planners want to make a difference here, they need to fundamentally challenge those kinds of ways to get around, ways to produce things, ways to distribute things. If we don't get to the fundamentals of this, all the bicycle paths and parks and greening of cities will not help.
Thank you. And if I may add to that insight of yours, because since my research is done in the Czech context and I deeply connected with the Czech context also, it's that I don't see it much as a problem only on the side of the planners, but I do see the problem also on the side of the local authorities and the state, and perhaps the official recognition of such processes, of such transformation processes taking place in the city's hinterland would actually help the planners and other professionals take the step to produce such new teachings in the territory. I think this movement should be on both sides, because the environment which is produced is usually acknowledged to the professionals, but indeed there are many actors and stakeholders that take part on it. So the suburbanization, in my perception, is not only as a result of those that have the land and transform it, or the newcomers and professionals, but also it's a game of politics and economics, as you mentioned also in the previous presentation. And perhaps it would be interesting to open this debate on understanding what is currently happening in the territory, knowing the diversities of the process, as Professor Ouředníček presented in the beginning, and accepting them and then talking together on how to deal with them. So that's just my insight.
Thanks, and I totally agree with this. I also wanted to mention I put a few sources into the chat in response to Josef Novotny's comment about the Global South. In our Global Suburbanisms project, we didn't differentiate between the informal settlement patterns in the South and suburbanization. We see them as one. Conceptually, they are empirically different. It's different, in terms of living in them. But we think conceptually of them as one, and I put some examples. And we have in our book series a volume on Latin America. It's the next book that's coming out, which is on Latin American suburbanization. It's the Global South. And we have a book in the works on African suburbanization. And there are many examples in our book After Suburbia and in the Massive Suburbanization book on forms of suburbanization, extended urbanization, outside of Europe and North America and Australia.
Well, I can't see any other questions on the chat, and I will definitely discuss with Greta about the Czech planning on the national level, and together with Pepa Novotný we can prepare something like the second seminar on Global South. Not only suburbanization, but something similar. So we spent now almost the whole 2 hours. I would like to thank all of participants, especially our guests from far west and far east, Roger, Steven, and Konstantin, and I would like to say thank you also to Adam and Adela, who prepare all the technical stuff. Hopefully it was interesting for all the participants, and have a nice rest of the day. In case of Konstantin, 1 hour left, and in case of Canadian's colleague, this is the wall. This is a wall Wednesday. So thank you again, and have a nice day, and goodbye.
Thank you for having us. Bye.
Thanks for a really interesting discussion.
Thanks. Goodbye.